I met murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they might be in admirable plight, for 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 he tossed them human hearts to chew, which from his wide cloak he drew. That poem is The Mask of Anarchy by Percy Bysshe Shelley, written in the 1810s when Castlereagh was a major figure on the British political scene. And it gives you a sense of just how unpopular he was in Britain in that period. There were many poems written about Castlereagh in that period, very few of them complimentary. Castlereagh ended up committing suicide in 1822. Lord Byron immediately rushed into print saying, "So, he has cut his throat at last. He, who? The man who cut his countries long ago." Byron, a few years earlier, had written an even worse verse where he was speculating about what might be written on Castlereagh's gravestone, what might be the epitaph when he died. And he came up with the lines, "Posterity shall ne'er survey a nobler grave than this. Here lies the bones of Castlereagh. Stop, traveller, and piss." So Castlereagh was this very controversial figure in Britain, but also in Ireland, especially in Ireland. He was seen as the traitor of his country, the Irishman who had crushed the 1798 rebellion and then brought through the Act of Union. Cornwallis wasn't blamed. Cornwallis had quite a good reputation because he had been lenient in 1798, he had been pro-Catholic. But Castlereagh was seen as the traitor of his country. On his deathbed, Henry Grattan tried to tell his son this. His son said, "For his part in the Union, Castlereagh undoubtedly deserves to die." And his father said, "No, do not be too hard on Castlereagh, for he loves Ireland." You know, one of the interesting things about Castlereagh, and in this part we will see, I suppose, Irish and then British history through the prism of Castlereagh's life, is that as Castlereagh himself reflected when he was planning on writing his memoirs, it seemed that whenever Castlereagh was given a job, it suddenly became the most important one in the empire. He became Chief Secretary of Ireland in March 1798. What happened? The 1798 rebellion broke out, and then he had to bring forward the Act of Union. He became War Secretary in the British government in the 1800s, and what happened? He had to bring together the huge war coalition against Napoleon. And then in the 1810s, he was made Foreign Secretary, just in time for the peace with France and the Congress of Vienna, and he impressed diplomats like Henry Kissinger with the brilliance of his peacemaking at Vienna in 1815. So Castlereagh was right in that context, in that sense. Every time he was given a job, it suddenly became the most important one. It's interesting that he originally came from a fairly liberal background. He had entered Parliament in 1790 as a Whig, as a reformer. But gradually, as the decade went on, he came under the influence of Burke when it came to France, and he became a supporter of William Pitt's administration. And so he was a good choice as Chief Secretary in 1798, even though he got it because he was the nephew of the Chief Secretary. He was also someone prone to nervous collapses. When he was part of a yeomanry group that was patrolling Ireland after Bantry Bay, and he spoke about how one night he saw a vision of a radiant boy, a ghostly boy, coming towards him, and he stood up and he stretched out his hand, and the vision disappeared. And he told that story in all seriousness at a dinner at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 that Walter Scott was at. And Walter Scott later said that he'd only ever heard 2 people in his life tell stories of visions like that, and both had committed suicide. During the passing of the Union, Castlereagh was, I suppose, the chief negotiator. He was the person who met with the people to try and see what they wanted, to try and persuade them to vacate their seats so they could bring in a unionist. He was the one who would see what their price was. And, to be honest, sometimes you had to deal with competing prices being offered by the opposition. The Bagwells were a family in Tipperary, and they controlled 4 seats. Bagwell himself and 3 of his sons were MPs, and they went to the government and got a price for their votes. Then they went to the opposition and got a higher price. And then they went back to the government and asked for a counteroffer. And Cornwallis intervened and he said, "This is disgusting. Don't give them any more money," and cancelled it all. And that's why Cornwallis, at the end of his time, complained about how disgusting his job was, being forced to job and work with all of these people and find out what they all wanted. Castlereagh had a reputation for being cold. Even Cornwallis, who worked closely with him, said, "He is so cold that nothing can touch him." But as we've said before, the best times for Castlereagh was when he was heated in debate, and then he would rise up and deliver a brilliant attack. And he was a very effective minister supporting the Union in 1799, even though all the rats deserted the government benches, direct treason resistance to the law proclaimed, as one MP said, and he was effective then. He was even more effective in 1800 when he was able to rally all the government supporters to his side. And as a result, he was rewarded for his part in the passing of the Union. He was given, promised a glorious, glittering career when he'd move over into British politics. And then the king went mad. And it looked like it would be all ended. And he had a breakdown similar to the one that would kill him in 1822. We see Castlereagh then becoming a very contentious figure in Ireland in the next number of years. He was hated. He ran for election in County Down, and again his childishness was held against him. He was accused of being Bobby, the boy with two strings to his bow, the man who they said it was useless to have him around the house because he never sweeps the chimney, he never winds the family clock. In other words, he's never impregnating his wife. And in the end, Castlereagh had to find a seat in Britain because he was so unpopular back at home. And he thought about how he would rehabilitate his reputation. He thought about getting one of his secretaries, Alexander Knox, who later became a key figure, he was a theologian, became a key figure in the Oxford movement in the 1820s. He considered asking him to write a history of the Union to show that corruption had not been used to accompany it. But of course, that would have been a deliberate rewriting of history to suit his own agendas. He fought a duel with his great rival, George Canning, in 1807 over attempts by Canning to remove him from the cabinet, but returned then and became War Secretary and later Foreign Secretary, and at the Congress of Vienna impressed people with the brilliance of his peacemaking skills. He was the person who impressed Metternich and then, in later years, politicians such as Henry Kissinger. But his Irish legacy, his Irish reputation always haunted him. And whenever the opposition MPs wanted to make things difficult for Castlereagh in the British Parliament, they would say, "You could hear torture from your windows in 1798. How many people were you responsible for having tortured?" And he answered them with a fury in 1817. He said, "With respect to Ireland, I know I shall never be forgiven. But I never had a cruel or an unkind heart." And he so won over many of his opponents that they ended up backing down. But with the larger public, he was still hated. There was the Peterloo massacres, where the soldiers had opened fire on crowds protesting in 1816, and that made him a demonised figure in the British press and prompted Shelley to write The Mask of Anarchy that we talked about. I met murder on the way. He had the mask, like Castlereagh. And Castlereagh really, I suppose, didn't really care so much about that. There was a time when the Cato Street conspirators planned to assassinate all of the cabinet ministers. They came to blows over who would get to slit the throat of Castlereagh. And Castlereagh began carrying 2 pistols around with him in public. And at the cabinet meetings, he'd sometimes open his waistcoat and there were the pistols. There was one time a crowd followed him when he was leaving his office. And he just chatted to them and didn't show any fear. So they were afraid to do anything. And when he got to his house, he just did an elegant bow and they gave him a round of applause because they admired his courage and his confidence. He returned to Ireland in 1821. And by now his father had died and he had changed from being Lord Castlereagh to being Lord Londonderry. And he travelled with George IV, who had recently succeeded his father as the king. And as they travelled together on the carriages, the crowds all cheered the king and they all cheered Castlereagh. And the king turned to Castlereagh and he said, I thought you were unpopular. I thought everyone hated you in Ireland. And Castlereagh said, it's not actually because of my politics. It's actually because of my personal beauty. Because Castlereagh was an incredibly handsome man. He was noted for his good looks. And he just joked with the king, it's because I'm so good looking. That's why they like me. Or he said, or maybe they don't actually know that Lord Londonderry, my new title, maybe they don't know that I used to be Lord Castlereagh. But the king wasn't very sure. So what happened? Well, in 1822, Castlereagh had another nervous breakdown. Similar to the one that he had in 1801, when it looked like the Union corrupt dealings would be exposed. And the cause of it, well, we're still not entirely clear. He accused himself of having become involved in various different homosexual activities. He said, I've been caught in a scandal similar to one that had ensnared the Bishop of Clogher. There was a story that he had gone to visit a prostitute and discovered the prostitute was a man and the man was blackmailing him. But these stories, far-fetched as they sound, are probably too far-fetched to be believable, because he accused himself of all kinds of crimes. He turned on his great friend, the Duke of Wellington, and said, I know you're my enemy. I know you're out to get me. And Wellington, who was his great friend, said, are you okay? And Wellington went to his wife and said, I think there's something wrong. You better look after him. So his wife took him down to their estate in the countryside and made sure that no blades were on him, that there wasn't even a knife and fork for him when he was having his meal. But he found a blade and he ended up being successful where Wolfe Tone had failed. And one morning when his breakfast was delivered, he took out the blade and slit his carotid artery and died instantly. And there was a big funeral at Westminster Abbey, a huge procession. But some people turned up to jeer and boo his passing coffin, because first of all they felt that a suicide should not be buried in Westminster Abbey alongside Pitt and some of the great figures of British history, and more jeered and booed his passing coffin because he was so unpopular in Britain, because he was so unpopular in Ireland, because of the Union and the 1798 rebellion. On his tombstone, and he's buried beside Pitt, it begins with the sentence, Ireland will never forget the statesman of the Legislative Union. And it's ironically true, because Ireland has never forgotten the statesman of the Legislative Union, but not in a good way. Bloody Castlereagh has become the bloody Castlereagh of legend, the man who passed the Union by perjury and fraud, the man who helped the Irish sell their souls for gold as Judas sold his God. And he has become this demonised figure. But I think when you reflect back on Castlereagh's whole career, I think it is very easy to make a case for the defence. That Castlereagh was someone who did what he thought was right for Ireland and for Britain. He thought that the Union, when accompanied by emancipation, would actually solve many of the problems in Irish history and would unite Catholics and Protestants together. And throughout his time in Britain, he tried to govern with justice and fairness. And that is why the Castlereagh of Byrne, the Castlereagh of Shelley, the Castlereagh of legend is a myth. The real Castlereagh is an Irishman who loved his country, who tried to reconcile Catholics and Protestants in a union that failed, and then became one of the great British statesmen of the 19th century. For some, no defence of Castlereagh is possible. For others, it is unnecessary.